Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining me. My name is Kristen, and these are my final thoughts for my November and December 2023 currently inked pens. This is going to be a little bit chaotic. I don't really have my notes all together, but I really just wanted to get my thoughts out for the past couple of months before it is too late. My mind is probably going to be all over the place, but I really just wanted to give you some feedback on my experiences for the past couple of months. Now, it took me 2 months to finally do this video because November and December are just really busy. It's just the busiest time of the year. So everyone's preparing for the holidays. You've got kids coming home for a longer break and everything just happening all at once. So I had these pens in use for a couple months. I have to be honest with you. There were some times where I didn't use pens at all just because of how much I needed to get done at home and outside the home. So my fountain pens and inks and papers, they kind of took a back seat for days and days at a time. And that actually had a huge effect on my perception, my experiences with some of these pen and ink pairings. I guess I can go ahead and go through these with the writing samples. So let me just do that. This is Diamine Cardinal, inked up in the Herbert Pen Company fountain pen with a 1.1 stub nib. This was actually a really pleasant writing experience. I finally figured out how to write with a stub nib, and it had to do with the rotation of the nib when I was writing with it. So I think I don't know, I might not have been tilting it this way enough. And so once I rotated enough, this 1.1 stub nib was one of my favorites for the months of November and December. So just as a comparison, if I come back here to this 1.1 stub, the TWSBI Diamond 580 had a 1.1 stub nib, and there were so many examples of railroading and skipping that I had to fight through whenever I used that nib, and it also just felt like it was way too thick for me. But if I come over here, I don't know. I think it had to do with the rotation. But then I also have to ask the question, is this 1.1 stub nib the same width as that 1.1 stub nib? One moment, I can actually take a look at that. So let me see if I can find the TWSBI Diamond 580 and compare the two nibs side by side. Come on now, be still. There we go. Okay. And now I can bring these a bit closer so we can see the side-by-side comparison of these two nibs. Now it looks like there's a bit of a gap between the two tines in the TWSBI Diamond 580. So maybe so that probably also has an effect on whether or not the nib performs as expected. It looks like the rounded corners on the TWSBI Diamond 580 are a bit sharper than the corners on this Yovo 1.1 stub nib. So there are a few variables that affected my experiences with these two different nibs. So that was my experience here. It was a beautiful red ink. It was just warm enough to be pleasant for me and not feel like I was grading papers. And I suspect that the stub nib also contributed to my fondness for this nib. This is the Platinum President in wine red. It has a fine nib, and this one was inked up with Ferris wheel press steeped umber. So sometimes this ink looked red and other times it looked brown. It's like a reddish brown color, I guess. And this is a beautiful Japanese fine nib. It was really pleasant to write with. I don't know. I liked it. I really did enjoy it, but it wasn't one of my top favorites. And I don't know if it had to do with the nib itself or if it had to do with the color of the ink, but it was a very reliable pen, a very good sized pen. So it wasn't too large, wasn't too small. It was not uncomfortable. After that one, we've got the Leonardo Momento Zero Grande. No, why do I keep trying to say Grande? This is the Leonardo Momento Zero in Nuvola with a medium gold nib. Now this ink, Diamine Winter Spice, sometimes you can see that blue shimmer. I think you can see it here. And other times it is very difficult to see it. Like, it doesn't exactly look like your typical shimmer where you can see individual particles, but the shimmer in this ink is more like a light blue haze. Like there's like the trick of the light or something. Every now and then you'll see a bit of blue, which I actually don't mind because there is plenty of blue in this pen. Oh my gosh, I just love looking at this thing. It is beautiful and it feels nice. Okay, don't get distracted. So I really, really enjoyed the bounciness of this Yovo gold nib. It's the rose gold trim, but it is a gold nib. It felt really pleasant, really nice coming out of this pen. The ink was just, it was lovely. Sometimes I wish that I had seen the blue shimmer a lot more often, but once I started to accept the fact that I'm going to see more brown and a little bit more sheen than the blue shimmer, once I managed my expectations, I began to appreciate the ink for what it was. This one, I've got to talk about these two fountain pens together because they're basically the same pen. This Pilot Elite has an extra fine nib, and this Pilot E95S in Burgundy has a fine nib. So this one had, of course, more feedback, and it was much more fine than the regular fine nib. These are Japanese extra fine and fine nibs. And I was so very nervous because I had never tried a Japanese extra fine nib before. And so thank you so much, Nadia, for giving me this experience. I forgot to mention this at the very beginning of the video, but thank you so much, Nadia, for loaning me so many of your fountain pens so that I could have some new experiences with different nibs and different fountain pens and a better understanding of the things that I do like and the things that I prefer not to have in my collection. So this is an extra fine nib. This has a fine nib, and I really liked them both. I liked them both. So when I started out using the extra fine nib, it's like, oh, this is really good. This is really nice. So this is what the extra fine looks like. And it is so crisp, so thin, so pleasant. And then when I write with this one, the fine nib, it's like, oh, I remember this feeling. It feels even smoother than the extra fine nib. And so I feel like I would be perfectly happy with the extra fine nib until I start writing with a fine nib, and it's like, oh, but this feels even smoother. Now, this fine nib reminds me of the fine nib on my Pilot Vanishing Point. That nib is just, it's beautiful. It is so nice, and I love how smooth it is when I use it on paper. Basically, any paper that I use, that nib feels like a smooth nib. And this gives me that same sensation when I'm writing with this one. It feels like the same nib, even though they look completely different. Okay, now this right here, this train wreck of a writing sample is my fault. Okay, where is it? Okay, so this right here is an example of what I was dealing with whenever I was trying to write with Diamine Best Wishes. It didn't matter if it was in one of my drier pens or if it was in one of my wetter pens. The ink basically dried out, got stopped up. I don't know if the shimmer was the issue or the fact that I had stopped writing with my fountain pens for an extended period of time. But this right here, it would not write consistently for some time. I have a feeling that this is probably the BENU fountain pen that began writing again eventually. Let me just go ahead and try it out now because I haven't emptied these just yet. Yeah, this is the BENU. And it writes just fine without extra prompting. It just took a little bit more scratch paper to get it writing properly again. With this Kaweco, it absolutely refused to write. Yeah, so it's still having issues right now. Getting back into like the swing of things, basically. And so what I had to do was I dipped a syringe into the Van Ness Pen's White Lightning ink additive and then dipped it into the converter so that the surface tension could break and hopefully make this a wetter writing fountain pen. But that didn't work because there's basically a clog here or somewhere in here. I should have put 2 to 5 milliliters of ink into a vial and then filled it up from there. But since I did not do that, it was way too wet in this pen, which means the ink kept dripping on the page. It was like a runny nose. Yeah, I was trying to write with a pen and it kept dumping ink on the page. So that's basically what was happening up here. I was hoping that eventually the ink would regulate itself, and it sort of did, but it took maybe this much. It took maybe this much of the page to do that, and it was back to normal, or at least fine down here. So this was not a pleasant experience with the Kaweco. Now, it is a very smooth nib, a very lovely fountain pen, but I would prefer to use wetter inks in this pen. I love the weight of the pen. I love the feel of it. I love the color and everything. I don't like how dry it writes. So this is, I guess, just a new learning experience for me. So this was inked up with Diamine Best Wishes, and my BENU Talisman Venus Hair is also inked up with Diamine Best Wishes. I had where are you? I had a slightly better writing experience with it, although it was still writing a bit dry from the beginning. It got back to normal. It went back to normal probably about the second half of the writing sample. So down here, there isn't much skipping at all, but it was still writing a bit drier than I would have preferred, just because of the fact that I had stopped using it. And this is a shimmer ink that I probably shouldn't just leave undisturbed in a fountain pen for extended periods of time. So that's those two pens. I wish that I had better experiences, but it was a learning experience. Okay, so this is my first ever experience with a Sailor Pro Gear Realo. Oh, I love the black trim. It's just so cool. This is the Supernova model from Box. It has an extra fine nib. This Sailor extra fine nib is even more fine than the Pilot Elite extra fine nib. This is the finest nib I have ever used. And it took me a while to realize that I actually love how fine this nib writes, because it reminds me of my inner gel cleaner with the 0.3 refill. It's the same thickness as my gel pen, and that's what I really do appreciate about this Japanese fine, extra fine nib. Now, one thing that I don't know if you could hear that. Oops, I smeared it. But these two are basically the same thickness, and I love it. I love it. I love it. I love that this is like ridiculously thin, and I love that this is ridiculously thin. The only issue that I have with this pen is that it feels like there is not a misalignment, but there is some roughness between the tines. So if I go straight down, I have no issues. But if I go to the side, there's some scratchiness. If I go this side, there's a bit of scratchiness as well. So if I, like in my horizontal strokes, there's way too much feedback. It's not feedback. There's actually scraping. It's scraping the paper. I realized that it's the issue with the nib. When I started turning it, instead of writing like this, I would tilt the nib a little bit to the side. So if I write like this and go here, it's smooth. And so if I write like this and use the left tine to write on the paper, it's smooth. But if I have it where it's this breather hole is straight up towards the ceiling, I feel that feedback between the tines. So that is one thing that I really did not appreciate about writing with this fountain pen. And I think it's just unique to this specific pen. And I'm hoping that not all Sailor extra fine nibs will feel like this when I'm writing with it. I love the thinness of the strokes, the lines that I can write with this fountain pen. And let me bring out my Hobonichi Weeks. I was so very impressed with how thin and how light these strokes were whenever I wrote with them. Now, I don't use as much pressure as I used to use with ballpoints and like roller balls or other gel pens. But when I started using this extra fine nib, I knew that I had to write with a lighter hand. And that took away some of the unpleasant experiences or the unpleasantness with that nib. So it feels really good when I use a super light hand, basically letting the pen write under its own weight. And I got so excited when I started writing in here. So my thoughts about this fountain pen: Quick Brown Fox jumps over the lazy dog. Oh my goodness. This is the fountain pen equivalent of my favorite gel pen, Pentel Inner Gel Cleaner 0.3 millimeters. Yes. So I love how roomy and how spacious this extra fine nib looks. And the same thing actually with the Platinum President with that fine nib and the Pilot Elite with the extra fine nib. The fine nib is nice. The Kaweco AL Sport is actually not bad either. And it's definitely thinner. It lays down a thinner line than the BENU Talisman Venus Hair with a medium nib. They're both medium nibs, but this one is much broader than the Kaweco medium nib. But the one that I really, really enjoyed using on like this small Hobonichi Weeks grid paper was the Sailor Pro Gear Realo. In spite of the scratchiness of the nib, I really enjoyed the weight of the lines. Okay, so this gives you basically an overview of the pens on the Hobonichi Weeks paper. Next is, I couldn't even finish it. I couldn't finish this one. This is the Pilot 78G. It has a double broad nib and it's inked up with the beautiful Diplomat Deep Green. And I could not finish it. I couldn't do it. I could not do it. This is the Pilot 78G. It's got a double broad nib, but it's basically a stub. It's some version of an metallic nib, but it has absolutely no tipping. So it's like a stubbish italic, or an italic style stub. All right, so this is what I have. And I concluded by this point that I would not be using this to do regular daily journaling or anything. I would be much more inclined to use this for headers. And I would also consider using a nib like this for actual italic style calligraphy. I just looked up something online to see, like, is it possible to do some italic style, writing with a nib like this? And absolutely yes. Now, I've never done this before. I just looked up like some beginner's tutorial on how to form these shapes so that you can combine them and make actual letters. I thought that was so cool to be able to do something like this and not have to buy a Pilot Parallel, but you can do like a stub or an italic nib. That's impressive. I would use this nib for headers instead of daily journaling. And I would also use this to explore like maybe italic style calligraphy. I did not write a new sample. I did not have a new sample of writing for the Leonardo Momento Grande because I already did it last month, or I did it in October. And so this is the pen that had the permanent ink in here. It was the Octopus Fluids Petrol Axolotl. And I'll bring this a bit closer so you can see what it looked like in writing. Now, this is a very nice ink, very pleasant, but I have this one thing against it. Because this is a matte finish fountain pen, it's basically absorbing the ink here. So once permanent ink dries, it won't budge. So this is permanently stained here. Now, if anyone has experience and you've worked a miracle by removing permanent ink from a matte fountain pen, please let me know what you did to make that happen. But I've just basically accepted that this is part of my fountain pen now. It was an okay experience. Now, I'm going to think twice about inking up permanent inks in my fountain pens. It did wash away pretty well. So like that's pretty clean. Yeah, it washed away really nicely, really well. I just, I'm a little bit bummed about there being a blue ring at the edge of my section. I'm glad it at least matches with the colors that are in the pen. But yeah, so that's that. It was a decent enough experience, but it felt a bit dry after having let the pen sit for basically 2 months with the same ink in there. After that one is my new Visconti Homo Sapiens with a medium nib. It's inked up with Anderillium Purple Gallinule Purple. Now, this pen writes beautifully. Oh, it feels so good. I love holding this lava rock resin. It just feels so nice. I love it. I love it. Okay, so this pen has a medium nib, and with Purple Gallinule Purple, it's like this juicy writer. I can tell it's a juicy writer. And it's balanced out by this dry purple ink. It's a beautiful color, absolutely gorgeous. And let me bring it closer to you so you can have a better view. Okay, so that is Anderillium Purple Gallinule Purple. Now, this is a good ink, but it does not like sitting undisturbed for long periods of time. This is how the ink looks coming from the Visconti Homo Sapiens fountain pen. It looks really nice, has great shading and everything. This is how it looked coming out of my Scribo Feel in September, I believe. Yeah, this was a writing in September, and it was so painful using the Scribo Feel with a fine flex nib inked up with Anderillium Purple Gallinule Purple. So there were like dry spells and super wet moments and all of that. And so it was very unpredictable, very unpleasant. But it was much more pleasant here in the Visconti Homo Sapiens. However, it still dried out after a day or two. And it was almost a nightmare trying to get it to write after several days of no writing. I have to be really careful whenever I want to use this ink. I cannot leave a pen inked up with this ink and out of commission for days at a time. This is not mine. This is the Sailor Pro Gear King of Pen, and it has a medium nib. This big old huge nib. It is so lovely to hold, and it is lovely to write with. Every time I wrote with this fountain pen, it just felt like a crime to put it back down. So every time, like whenever I wrote like a short note or something, it just like if I just wrote 2 words, Diamine Violet, and I had to put the pen down because that's all I needed to write, it felt wrong to put the pen down. Like every time I picked it up, it felt like I needed to write a full page of something because the nib is just so pleasant. It's soft and bouncy, yet still has a little bit of sailor feedback, but not so much that it just feels like you're writing on cold pressed watercolor paper. So, but it feels really good. And this is Diamine Violet. Very cool tone purple. Very pleasant. I like how it felt. I like how it looks. It matches well with the pen. I don't think I have any complaints about this pen and ink combination. It did dry out over time. Like it was slowly drying out because once again, I was using and not using these pens over the past 2 months. And this last one is Diamine Amazing Amethyst. This was inked up in the Hinze Pen Company fountain pen in Mysterious Mermaid, and it has a medium nib. PVD coating, it has like a very unique feedback to it. It reminds me of whenever I wrote with a fresh dry erase marker on a freshly cleaned dry erase board. So that squeaky feel and that squeaky sound, I kind of get those same sensations whenever I use this fountain pen. So I still haven't decided. I don't know if it bothers me, and I don't know if I'm okay with it, if I appreciate it or not. I'm still undecided. But this ink is beautiful. And I don't think I had any issues with this pen drying out or anything. So it's a lovely dark, sort of desaturated purple, and it was gorgeous. I wrote with it. I had fun with it. All right, so are there any other writing samples that I need to show you? Oh yeah, this was a packing list. This was a packing list that I was using for my trip to Georgia for our Thanksgiving, our family Thanksgiving celebration. Even when I just needed a sheet of paper and a pen or two, I used these two because they were just so very nice, so very pleasant. Okay, so now moving on, I'll go ahead and rank these pens from most to least favorite. Number 1 is my Leonardo Momento Zero in the Nuvola finish, inked up with Diamine Best Wishes. And the second one is the Herbert Pen Company fountain pen with the 1.1 stub nib. So like I said before, these two were the 2 fountain pens that I used the most often during those 2 months, even when I was super busy with trying to get things together. Those were the pens that I always gravitated towards. If it wasn't a gel pen, it was those 2 pens. The third is the Sailor Pro Gear King of Pens, because it was just wrong. It felt wrong. It felt wrong to put the pen down after writing like just one sentence. Like, can I just write a little bit more? This one was really inviting me to write more. Whenever I picked it up, I needed another excuse to write something else. And number 4 is the Visconti Homo Sapiens Dark Age. Purely because of the ink selection, I really expect to have a much better experience in the future with a better ink, because Anderillium Purple Gallinule Purple is just a dry ink. The Hinze Pen Company with the medium nib, and it's inked up with Diamine Amazing Amethyst. This was a really reliable fountain pen, and the only strike against it is like that squeaky noise that I just don't know what to do with. I don't know what to do with that squeaky noise. Okay, so that's 5. 6 is the Pilot E95S with a fine nib. I just really like how pleasant the fine nib feels whenever I use it. And number 7 is the Platinum President with a fine nib inked up with Ferris Wheel Press Steeped Umber. It's nice and reliable, but it didn't really stand out as an amazing writing experience. It was nice and reliable. 8? No, it's this one. It's this Pilot. It is the Pilot Elite with an extra fine nib. It is really good, but the things that I like about it are just for utilitarian purposes. Like, it is useful to have a pen like this, but it wasn't something that I really, really wanted to use over and over again. Number 9 is the BENU Talisman Venus Hair. And that's only because of the ink that's in this pen. This is a beautiful fountain pen. I love holding it. It's like the perfect size for my hand, but the ink dried out in it. And I was actually surprised because this is a pretty reliable fountain pen. 10 is the Sailor Pro Gear Realo with an extra fine nib, only because of the scratchiness between the times. 11 is the Leonardo Momento Zero Grande in Primary Manipulation 1 with a matte finish. This has a fine nib, and it was inked up with Octopus Fluids Petrol Axolotl. And it's number 11 because I just didn't enjoy writing with this pen as much as I did the others, and the ink was dry and it stained the section. Number 12 is the Kaweco AL Sport, because I had such a difficult experience writing with this pen. And 13, which it really could be tied with the Kaweco AL Sport, is the Pilot 78G, just because it's so broad. The nib is so broad, it writes so broad, and it took me basically 2 months to figure out what I could do with this nib. When I finally realized that I could be doing this with the pen, its usefulness really increased dramatically for me. But for the requirements that I had during November and December, this is in the 13th place for me. So I think that is it for my final thoughts of the November and unofficially December fountain pens. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think about these pens and about my writing experiences with these. If you have a different opinion of these pens, please let me know what your experience has been. And I look forward to seeing you all in the next video. Thank you so much for being with me and for subscribing and watching my videos this year. It has been a great experience just exploring pens and inks with you all. So I hope to see you all in the new year. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye-bye.